This is my true story. I buried my wife, Martha, 10 years ago, but yesterday I received a letter signed by her. The envelope was a stark, almost sterile white, and the return address was a law firm I'd never heard of. What I discovered when I opened it destroyed my reality. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now, and please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. For 15 years before that tragic day, Martha and I lived a life most people could only dream of. We had built our family estate with love and hard work, a testament to our shared dreams. As a retired judge, I had seen my share of betrayal and deceit in court, but I always believed our home was a sanctuary from all that. Our son, Michael, and his wife, Sarah, were frequent visitors, and though I sometimes found their extravagant tastes a little much, I loved them. They were my only connection to Martha after she was gone, a comfort in my profound grief. But as the years turned the house into a hollow echo of the past, I began to realize that my family wasn't visiting to help me remember Martha. They were visiting to help me forget myself. I sit on the porch of the estate I built with my own hands. The wood under my chair is solid oak, much like the foundation of the life I spent 40 years constructing. To my left, the rose bushes Martha planted are in full bloom. They are a deep, violent red, the same color as the sunset, and the same color as the blood I saw on the asphalt 10 years ago. I am 70 years old, a retired judge, and a man who understands the weight of a verdict. The sound of gravel crunching under expensive tires breaks my peace. My son David and his wife Clara walk up the driveway. They don't walk like guests. They walk like inspectors. They don't see a father waiting for a visit. They see a walking bank account. David adjusts his silk tie, his eyes scanning the crown molding of the porch, as if he is already calculating the cost per square foot. "Dad, you're just sitting here in the dark again," David says. He doesn't hug me. He stands over me, casting a shadow that feels cold. "This house is too big for a ghost, Julian. It's a mausoleum." He drops a glossy brochure on my lap. I don't pick it up. I look at the title. Golden Oaks, Luxury Senior Living. Clara smirks, smoothing her designer skirt. She leans against the porch railing, her jewelry clinking. "Think of the travel we could do with the equity, Julian. You've worked so hard. Don't you think it's time to let go of all this maintenance? We could finally see the world together." "The world is a very loud place, Clara," I reply. My voice is calm. It is the voice I used when I presided over the highest courts in the state. I find that I prefer the quiet of my own land. "But the market is peaking," David insists, pacing the length of the porch. "We could get 6, maybe 7 million for this acreage. Think of what that does for the family, for my firm, for our future." "Your future or mine?" I ask. I watch his eyes flicker. He isn't a good liar. He never was. "For everyone," he says quickly. "You're getting forgetful, Dad. Last week you left the garden hose running. It's a safety issue. This facility has 24-hour staff. You'd be safe. We'd be relieved." I look down at the brochure. I see the price of my dignity printed in fine blue ink. They think I'm a senile old man. They think my silence is a sign of a fading mind. They have been gaslighting me for months, trying to convince me that my memory is failing so they can seize the deed. "I will consider it," I say. I let a small, tired smile touch my lips. David beams. He reaches out and pats my shoulder, a gesture that feels more like a claim of ownership than an act of affection. "That's the spirit, Dad. I knew you'd see reason. I'll bring the paperwork over this weekend." "Do that," I say. I watch them walk back to their car, their steps lighter than when they arrived. They believe they have won. They think they are the hunters and I am the prey. They don't realize that in my world, silence isn't agreement. It's a trap. I am a judge. I know how to wait for the evidence to align. The real trial hasn't even begun. The taillights of David's car faded into the distance, but the chill of his senior living brochure still sat heavy on my lap. I stayed on the porch until the moon took the place of the sun, wondering when my own flesh and blood had started seeing me as a hurdle rather than a father. The next day at noon, a courier bike pulled up the driveway. The rider handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope. The return address read Miller and Associates. I recognized the name of the law firm Martha had used for her personal estate. I took it to my study, my hands steady as I broke the wax seal. Inside was a letter. The paper was yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Martha's elegant, slightly shaky script. "Julian, if you are reading this, you are strong enough to know the truth," the letter began. My breath hitched. I sat in my leather chair, the same chair I sat in when the police told me a hit and run had taken her life a decade ago. I read her words, and the world outside my window seemed to stop. She described that rainy Tuesday night. She hadn't died instantly. She had seen the car that struck her. She had seen the driver. It was David's silver coupe, Julian. He didn't stop. He slowed down, looked me in the eye, and then he accelerated. He didn't want to wait for an inheritance. He wanted it then. The police said the brakes failed on my car later that week, but they didn't, Julian. He cut them. I saw him in the garage that morning with his tools. I didn't cry. Tears are for the helpless, and I have never been helpless. Instead, the grief I had carried for 10 years compressed into a cold, hard diamond of rage. My son hadn't just been greedy. He was a predator. I picked up the desk phone. I didn't call the local precinct. I dialed a private number I hadn't used in years. It belonged to Arthur, my old law clerk, who now ran the most successful private investigation firm in the city. "Julian, is that you?" Arthur's voice was full of surprise. "It's been a long time, Judge." "It has, Arthur. I hope you're still as discreet as you were in my chambers," I said. My voice was like ice. "For you? Always. What do you need?" "I need a favor, a big one," I replied. "I need you to dig into a 10-year-old accident. I want bank records, mechanic logs, and every piece of paper my son has signed since his mother died. I want to know exactly how much he's stolen while I was busy grieving." "That's a heavy list, Julian. Is everything okay?" "Everything is finally clear, Arthur," I said, looking at Martha's photo on my desk. "I'm just presiding over one last trial, and this time I'm the executioner." I hung up the phone. The house was quiet, but for the first time in a decade, I wasn't alone. Martha had given me the evidence. Now I would provide the verdict. The silence of the study felt different after hanging up with Arthur. The letter from Martha sat on the desk like a loaded weapon, its truth echoing through the hallways of the house. I hadn't moved from my chair when my cell phone began to vibrate. It was David. Again. I answered on the fourth ring. "Hello, David. Dad! Finally!" he snapped, his voice tight with the stress he couldn't quite hide. "I've been calling for an hour. Clara and I are coming over for dinner tonight. We need to talk about that developer. They're getting impatient, and honestly, so am I. We need to move on this house." "Patience is a virtue you never quite mastered, David," I said, my voice smooth as aged whiskey. "But you're right. We should talk. Come at 7. By the time they arrived, I had set the table with the fine china, the set Martha only used for celebrations. I watched from the window as they climbed out of their car. David was sweating through his shirt, his eyes darting toward the roofline of the estate, as if he were already measuring it for a wrecking ball. Clara was checking her reflection in the car window, adjusting a gold watch that I knew had been purchased with the first payout of Martha's life insurance. Inside, I served the steak. I sliced through the meat with surgical precision while David paced the dining room. "The developer offered an extra 10% if we sign by Friday," David said, his mouth full of food. "It's a no-brainer, Dad. You get a nice suite at Golden Oaks, and Clara and I can finally expand the firm. Everyone wins." Clara nodded, her eyes cold and calculating. "It's about your legacy, Julian. You don't want this place to rot, do you? You're so forgetful lately. You might leave the stove on next time. It's for the best." I took a slow sip of my wine, watching her over the rim of the glass. "You've mentioned my memory quite often lately, Clara. It's curious. I remember things quite vividly. For instance, I remember the exact cost of this table." "That's not what we mean, Dad," David interjected, leaning forward. "We're talking about the big picture. I've already drafted the power of attorney. You just need to sign, and then the stress is off your shoulders. We'll handle the taxes, the sale, all of it." "You want the power of attorney?" I asked. I leaned back, my posture commanding the room. The alpha wasn't a mask. It was who I was. You want total control over my life and my assets? It's for your protection, David lied. He reached into his briefcase and slid a stack of papers across the lace tablecloth, right next to Martha's favorite gravy boat. I looked at the documents. They weren't just for the house. They were a total surrender of my autonomy. He was asking me to hand him the keys to my coffin while I was still breathing. I've decided to settle the entire estate this weekend, I said, my voice dropping an octave. One big dinner. I'll invite the whole family and a few close colleagues. We'll sign everything then. One final legacy gala. David practically vibrated with greed. He looked at Clarice, a triumphant smirk breaking across his face. That's my man. A gala. It'll be the talk of the town. Oh, it certainly will be, I replied. I picked up the papers and tucked them into my jacket pocket. I'll make sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve. They left an hour later, laughing as they walked to their car. They thought they had finally broken me. They didn't realize that I wasn't settling the estate. I was preparing the evidence for a final public sentencing. The predatory glee in David's eyes as he left stayed with me long after the sound of his engine died out. I didn't go to bed. Instead, I retreated to my study, the inner sanctum where I had spent decades deconstructing the lies of criminals. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the lingering presence of Martha's letter. I pulled the heavy, leather-bound folders from the bottom drawer of my desk, the files from the accident. For 10 years I had kept them as a shrine to my grief. Tonight, I opened them as a prosecutor. I spread the forensic photos across the mahogany surface. I looked at the twisted metal of Martha's sedan, specifically the undercarriage. The police report mentioned a brake line failure, likely due to wear and tear. Looking at the photos now with the scales removed from my eyes, the wear looked suspiciously like a clean, singular slice. At exactly 6 a.m, my old friend Chief Miller arrived at the back door. He carried a manila envelope and 2 coffees. His face was etched with the weariness of a man who had seen too much of the world's underside. "You sure about this, Julian?" Miller asked, sitting at the kitchen table. "Reopening this wound. It's going to be messy." I didn't say a word. I simply slid Martha's letter across the table. Miller read it in silence. I watched his jaw tighten and his eyes go pale as he reached the part about David, looking her in the eye. "My God," Miller whispered. "We were so focused on comforting you, we never even looked at him. He was the grieving son. We took his word for everything." "He played his part well," I said, my voice steady and cold. "While I was busy grieving, he was burying the truth. But parasites always leave a trail. What did Arthur find?" Miller opened his envelope and spread out a series of financial statements. "Your clerk is thorough. David's law firm hasn't made a profit in 3 years. He's been underwater since he bought that yacht. To keep the lights on, he's been draining your secondary trust. He's forged your signature on over 40 checks. He wasn't just waiting for you to die, Julian. He's been eating you alive while you're still standing." I looked at the signatures. They were good, but they lacked the firm, authoritative stroke I had developed over 40 years on the bench. They were the signatures of a coward trying to sound like a king. "He's also been in contact with a mechanic," Miller continued, pointing to a phone log. "A man named Silas. We checked Silas's records. 10 years ago, David paid him $20,000 in cash 2 days after the funeral for restoration work on a car that was crushed for scrap a week later. He paid to hide the murder weapon," I muttered. The rage inside me was no longer a fire. It was a frost. It was a calculated judicial necessity. "We have enough to bring him in for questioning," Miller said, looking at me. "No," I replied, standing up. "In my courtroom, we don't just arrest. We reveal. I want him to feel the full weight of the law when he thinks he's at his highest point. Keep the files, Miller. Be ready for the gala this weekend. I'll provide the stage. You provide the handcuffs." Miller nodded, his expression grim. "I'll be there, Judge. Just give the signal." I walked him to the door and watched the sunrise. The light was harsh and unforgiving, exactly like the truth. David thought he was clearing the way for his future. He didn't realize he was just paving the road to his own cell. The evidence from Miller and Arthur sat locked in my safe, a silent arsenal ready for deployment. To ensure David and Clara didn't suspect a thing, I began to play the part they had written for me, The fading lion. I intentionally wore mismatched socks and left my tea to go cold on the side table. It was a tactical retreat, designed to draw the enemy into a false sense of security. By Thursday afternoon, David and Clara arrived unannounced. They didn't knock. They used their spare key, a privilege I would soon revoke. I was in the garden, standing near Martha's roses. "Dad, where are the keys to the silver cabinet?" David called out, his voice sharp with impatience. He walked onto the porch, not waiting for an answer. "We're starting to tag the furniture for the auction house. They need to come through tomorrow." I turned slowly, squinting as if the sun were too bright. "The silver? That was your mother's pride, David. We shouldn't move it yet." "Don't be difficult, Julian," Clara said, stepping out behind him. She was holding a stack of yellow stickers. She walked over to a hand-carved mahogany side table and slapped a sticker right on the polished surface. "It's all just wood and metal. You won't have room for it in the facility anyway." David pushed past me into the house. I followed him, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. I found him in the dining room. He was holding Martha's favorite porcelain vase, a delicate hand-painted piece we had bought on our honeymoon in Florence. "This junk is taking up space," David said. He looked at it with a sneer of disgust. "It's chipped anyway. To the thrift store box it goes." "David, please," I said, my voice intentionally trembling. "That vase held the flowers I brought her every Sunday for 40 years. Put it back." "Get over it, Dad. Mom is dead," David snapped. He didn't just place it in the cardboard box. He tossed it. The sound of the porcelain shattering against the floor of the box was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "You're living in a fantasy. It's time to wake up to the real world. We're in charge now." I looked at the shards of white and blue inside the box. My hands shook, but not from age. They shook with the restrained power of a man who had the legal authority to erase David's entire existence with a single phone call. I looked up at my son. In that moment, the last fragment of paternal instinct died. He wasn't a man who had made a mistake. He was a parasite who enjoyed the sting. "You're right, David," I said, my voice returning to its base, alpha frequency, though he was too arrogant to notice the shift. "The real world is much harsher than this house. I see that now." Clara laughed, a shrill, grating sound. "Finally! I'll call the movers for Monday. We can have the estate cleared by the time the gala ends on Saturday night." "The gala," I repeated, a cold smile forming. "Yes, we must make sure everything is in order for the gala. I want the world to see the legacy you've built." "We'll make you proud, Dad," David said, checking his watch. "We've got a meeting with the developer. Try not to wander off or forget to lock the door, okay?" I watched them drive away, their laughter echoing in the driveway. I walked over to the cardboard box and picked up a single shard of the Florence porcelain. It was sharp enough to draw blood. I tucked it into my pocket, a physical reminder of the debt that was about to be collected. I went to the basement and began testing the audiovisual equipment for the dining room. The secret boss was no longer hiding. He was simply waiting for the opening remarks. The shard of porcelain in my pocket felt like a cold coal, a reminder that the time for sentiment had passed. I spent the evening in my study, not as a grieving widower, but as a master tactician. If David and Clara wanted a legacy gala, I would give them one they would never forget. I opened my leather-bound address book and began making the calls myself. I didn't want an assistant to handle this. I wanted to hear the voices of the people who would witness the fall. First, I called the senior partners at David's law firm. "Julian, we've been hearing great things about the estate sale." The managing partner, Marcus, boomed over the line. "David says you're finally taking it easy." "David has a vivid imagination, Marcus," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "I'm hosting a formal dinner this Saturday to settle the estate. I want the firm's leadership there. It's a matter of professional and personal integrity." "We wouldn't miss it, Judge," Marcus replied, his tone shifting to one of respect. Even in retirement, my name still carried the weight of the bench. Next, I called the board members of the Children's Hope charity, where Clara served as a director. I knew for a fact she had been using the charity's gala tickets to social climb, while skimming from the silent auctions. I invited them under the guise of a major legacy donation. "I'm giving it all away," I told the board chair. "The house, the assets, the family name. I want you there to witness the transfer. I spent the rest of the day orchestrating the logistics. I hired a high-end catering crew, but I gave them very specific instructions. The menu would be the same one served at Martha's funeral luncheon 10 years ago, a subtle psychological pressure for the man who thought he had gotten away with it. On Friday afternoon, David stopped by, his chest puffed out like a peacock. I saw the guest list, Dad. The senior partners? The charity board? This is huge. My promotion is basically a lock after this. It's important to have witnesses when a life's work is handed over, David, I said, polishing a silver spoon. I didn't look up at him. I didn't need to. I could hear the greed in his breathing. And you're sure about the power of attorney? He asked, leaning over the table. You'll sign it in front of everyone. Everything will be signed and sealed before the night is over, I promised. I went to the jeweler later that day. I didn't buy a gift for my son. I bought a small, elegant travel watch and a one-way ticket to Lake Como, Italy. I spent the evening packing a single suitcase. I didn't need the mahogany tables or the silver spoons. I only needed my name, untarnished, and the peace of knowing the truth was out. I looked at the guest list one last time. It wasn't a party. It was a jury pool. I was the judge, the prosecutor, and the only one who knew the sentence. As I turned out the lights, I felt Martha's presence in the quiet house. One more day, Martha, I whispered into the dark. Justice is coming home. The smell of the funeral lilies I'd ordered filled the foyer, a scent that most guests took for elegance, but I knew David would recognize as a ghost. The house was glowing, every chandelier dimmed to a conspiratorial amber. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching the vultures arrive in their finest silks and wools. David and Clara were already there, acting like the masters of the manor. David was holding a crystal tumbler of my best scotch, laughing with Marcus and the other partners. Clara was draped in a floor-length emerald gown, holding court with the charity board. They looked like the perfect couple, successful, vibrant, and utterly hollow. Look at him, David whispered to Clara as I descended the stairs. He didn't think I could hear him. The old man looks like he's walking to his own wake. Let him, Clara murmured back, patting his arm. Just get that signature, David, the developer called again. The offer is on the table for 48 hours. I reached the bottom step and smoothed my tuxedo jacket. Good evening, everyone, I said, my voice carrying across the room without effort. The chatter died down instantly. Please take your seats. Tonight is about legacy, and I wouldn't want the soup to get cold. We moved into the dining room. I sat at the head of the long table, the same seat I had occupied for 40 years. David sat to my right, the power of attorney documents tucked into the breast pocket of his suit. Clara sat to my left, her eyes darting toward the antique silver. As the first course was served, the same poached salmon served a decade ago, the atmosphere grew heavy. David took a bite and froze. He looked at the plate, then at me. He recognized the menu. His hand trembled slightly, the fork clinking against the china. Is something wrong, David? I asked, my tone perfectly conversational. You haven't touched your wine. It's fine, Dad, he stammered. Just a bit of nostalgia, I guess. Nostalgia is a powerful thing, I said, addressing the table. It reminds us of where we came from, and sometimes it reminds us of what we've tried to bury. Clara laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. Julian, you're being so dramatic tonight. We're all here to celebrate your retirement and the transition of the estate. You're right, Clara, I said, standing up. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small remote. But before we sign anything, I have a tribute to share. A message from someone who couldn't be here tonight, but whose presence is felt in every corner of this room. David leaned in, his face pale. Dad, what are you doing? This isn't the time. Sit down, David, I said. It wasn't a request. It was a judicial order. The room went silent. I pressed the button. The speakers I had hidden behind the heavy drapes crackled to life. It wasn't music. It was the sound of a woman's voice, breathless, pained, but unmistakably Martha's. Julian, I am writing this from the hospital bed. I don't have long. I need you to know it wasn't an accident. The color drained from David's face so fast I thought he might faint. He looked at the guests, then at the drapes, his eyes wide with a terror I had waited 10 years to see. The trap was sprung, and the Last Supper was about to become a sentencing hearing. The sound of Martha's voice hung in the air like a shroud. Guests sat frozen, their forks suspended halfway to their mouths. David's hand gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. His breathing was shallow, the sound of a trapped animal realizing the cage door has been bolted. "This is a fake!" David suddenly screamed, slamming his fist onto the table. The crystal glasses rattled and a few guests gasped. "He's senile!" "He's using some kind of AI to torture me because he's losing his mind. Clara, tell them." Clara stood up, her face a mask of panicked indignation. "This is elder abuse. Julian, turn that off right now. You're sick, and this proves you aren't fit to manage your own affairs." I didn't turn it off. I leaned back in my chair, my expression as unmoving as granite. The recording was digitized from a cassette tape held in a timed release vault by Miller and Associates for 10 years, Clara. It is quite authentic, and it is only the beginning of the discovery phase. I looked toward the heavy oak doors leading to the kitchen. "Chief Miller, I believe we've reached the point of no return." The doors swung open. Two of the caterers who had been serving the salmon stepped forward, shedding their white aprons to reveal the badges and holsters of the state police. Behind them walked Chief Miller, looking every bit the enforcer of the law. The room erupted into hushed whispers and sharp intakes of breath. "David Harris, you are under arrest for the murder of Martha Harris," Miller said, his voice booming in the confined space. "You can't do this," David shrieked, lunging for the speaker system behind the drapes, as if he could kill his mother's voice a second time. I didn't have to move a muscle. One of the officers intercepted him, spinning him around and slamming him against the mahogany table. The power of attorney papers flew out of David's pocket, fluttering to the floor like useless confetti. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the room, a sound more satisfying than any gavel I had ever struck. "Dad, tell them," David sobbed, his face pressed against the wood. "I'm your son. You can't let them do this." I walked over to him, looking down at the man who had traded his mother's life for a silver coupe and a yacht. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the sharp shard of Florence porcelain I had saved from the basement. I laid it on the table next to his head. "I'm not just your father, David. I'm a judge," I said, my voice a low, terrifying rumble. "And I have seen the evidence. I have the bank records of the 40 checks you forged. I have the statement from Silas, the mechanic you paid to crush your car. And I have the letter from the woman you left to die in the rain." Clara tried to slip toward the hallway, but the second officer stepped into her path. "Sit down, Mrs. Harris," the officer said. "We have a warrant for you as an accessory after the fact. We know about the offshore account you used to hide the insurance payout." I looked at the senior partners of David's firm. Their faces were twisted in disgust. "I believe your firm has a morality clause in its partnership agreement, Marcus," I said. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on David. "Consider his desk cleared by morning, Julian. I am so incredibly sorry." I watched as they led my son away. He wasn't screaming anymore. He was just a broken, hollow shell of a man. I didn't feel a flicker of pity. The execution was cold, systematic, and final. The predator had been hunted, and the old man was the only one left standing in the light. The echoes of the police sirens faded into the night, leaving the dining room in a silence so thick it felt physical. My guests sat like statues, their eyes darting between the empty chair where David had been and me. I remained at the head of the table, my posture straight, my hands resting calmly on the white linen. I was no longer the grieving widower or the forgetful old man. I was the arbiter of this estate. "I apologize for the disruption to your meal," I said, my voice cutting through the tension with the sharp edge of a blade. "But justice rarely keeps a polite schedule." Clara was still in the room, slumped in her chair as an officer stood behind her. Her emerald dress, which had looked so regal an hour ago, now looked like the costume of a thief. She looked up at me, her eyes red with a mixture of fear and venom. "You think you've won, Julian? You're still an old man in a house that's falling apart. David might be gone, but I'm still his wife. I have rights to this property. I have rights to the accounts." I didn't argue. I simply reached into the leather portfolio I had placed near my seat earlier. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, the deed to the estate. "You speak of rights, Clara, But you forget that I wrote the laws you try to hide behind, I said. I slid the paper down the table toward her. This house hasn't been in my name for 48 hours. I have deeded the entire property, along with the liquid assets from Martha's trust, to the Martha Harris Foundation for Justice. It is a non-profit dedicated to reopening cold cases of vehicular manslaughter. Clara's jaw dropped. She grabbed the paper, her eyes scanning the legal jargon. You gave it away? Millions of dollars? You're leaving yourself with nothing. I'm leaving myself with everything that matters, I replied. I looked at the senior partners and the charity board members. And as for your rights, Clara, I filed a civil suit for the recovery of stolen funds an hour before this dinner began. Every cent you spent on that watch, those dresses, and your offshore accounts has been flagged as fruits of a criminal enterprise. You don't have a house, Clara. You don't even have the chair you're sitting on. The board chair of the charity stood up, his face grim. Julian, we had no idea. The board will be conducting a full audit of Clara's department immediately. We'll cooperate with the police. I expected nothing less, I said. I stood up, the movement fluid and strong. I looked at Clara one last time. She wasn't a daughter-in-law. She was a parasite who had finally run out of blood to drink. The officers will escort you out now, Clara. I believe they have a very small, very cold room waiting for you. As she was led away, screaming about lawyers and unfairness, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The secret boss wasn't about the money or the land. It was about the absolute power of the truth. I had stripped them of their masks and their means in one clean stroke. I turned to my remaining guests, the men and women who held the keys to the city's social and legal circles. The gala is over, I announced, and so is the Harris legacy, as you knew it. A new one begins tomorrow. I walked out of the dining room, leaving them to whisper in the shadows of a house that no longer belonged to any of us. I had held the power all along. I had simply waited for the moment when losing it would hurt them the most. The front door of the estate clicked shut behind me for the last time. The heavy oak sound didn't carry the weight of loss. It carried the finality of a closed case. I stood on the porch, the air crisp and smelling of the damp earth Martha loved so much. The sirens were long gone, and the house sat in a dignified silence, ready to be transformed into a sanctuary for others, rather than a cage for me. I left the keys under the heavy stone lion at the entrance for the foundation directors to find in the morning. The drive to the airport was the most peaceful journey I had taken in a decade. I didn't look back at the silhouette of the chimneys against the starlight. I had spent 10 years mourning a tragedy that was actually a crime, and tonight I had finally balanced the ledger. I realized as I drove that respect is not something you demand from people like David and Clara. It is something you protect by refusing to enable their rot. I arrived at the terminal an hour before dawn. I moved through the airport with a steady gait, my single suitcase rolling behind me. I didn't feel like a 70-year-old man fleeing a wreckage. I felt like a man who had finally stepped out of a courtroom after a lifetime of presiding over others. I reached the first-class lounge and sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the horizon turn a soft, bruised purple. A young attendant approached me with a polite smile. "Can I get you anything, sir? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee, black," I said. My voice was calm, the alpha authority, now tempered by a quiet grace. "And perhaps a newspaper." "Heading somewhere special?" she asked as she set the tray down. I looked at the ticket resting on the table. Destination, Lake Como. "I'm fulfilling a promise," I told her. "One that's 10 years overdue." When the boarding call for my flight came, I stood up and didn't hesitate. I walked down the jet bridge, feeling the hum of the engines beneath my feet. I found my seat and looked out at the runway. The sun was finally breaking over the line of the world, casting long golden shadows across the tarmac. I thought about the lesson I had learned. True family isn't about shared blood, it's about shared honor. I had lost a son, but I had reclaimed my wife's memory and my own dignity. I had spent years being gentle and understanding while parasites picked at my life. Tonight, I proved that justice doesn't have an expiration date, and that a man of action is never truly old until he gives up his power. As the plane lifted off, the ground fell away, taking the estate the law firm, and the holding cells with it. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. For the first time in 10 years, the voice in my head wasn't Martha's scream or David's lies. It was just the wind. I was alone, I was at peace, and I was finally free. The verdict was in. The trial was over. If you love my story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you have watched it from. This inspires us to share more such stories with you. If you love my story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you have watched it from. This inspires us to share more such stories with you.